video we're going to be discussing fuel sending units and fuel filters. So the term sending unit has sort of a broader meaning, and it kind of means something a little bit different when it comes to fuel systems. A sending unit is basically a sensor for a gauge. So the little pressure sensor that screws into our oil galley to report to our oil pressure warning light, or our oil pressure gauge would be called a sending unit. The temperature sending unit that screws into our cooling jackets to report back to our temp gauge or our temp light on the dashboard would be a sending unit. And this piece in the gas tank is a sending unit. So this little piece right here. So because we like to know how much fuel is in the tank, we put a gauge on the dashboard because it's way more convenient than running out of fuel. And to report to that gauge the level of fuel in the tank, we, to this day, basically use some pretty old school technology. We have a float on an arm, and that arm attaches to a rheostat, which is basically a variable resistor, and that resistance alters the position of the fuel gauge up on the dashboard. So because of this thing's function, this whole thing kind of became known as a sending unit, but it actually has a couple of other purposes. So we'll talk about that. So a fuel tank sending unit is somewhere down in the tank, and it has a variable resistor on a float, or a float attached to a variable resistor, and that's going to alter the position of our fuel gauge. In this assembly, we generally also find a little pickup strainer or a screen and a tube that leads out so that we can get the fuel out of the tank. So this is the original sending unit from my 67 Ford Fairlane. It kind of goes into the tank from below. It kind of goes in sort of like this. So the overall shape of the tank is something like this. It's two metal halves kind of crimped together. And this sending unit kind of goes in from the bottom towards the front. There's an opening. And it fits right in there. And we have our pickup tube that goes down in there, and there's a screen. And then hanging off of that tube, we have a little bracket. And we have our variable resistor. And attached to that, the red marker's dying, we have a float. So here's the float, here's our variable resistor, and then we have a little strainer or a screen. The fuel line sticks out of the tank, a little electrical terminal sticks out, that's wired up, in this case by a metal strap, and that gets wired off to our gauge. So in this case, the tank being metal and the sending unit being metal, the other terminal of this resistor is the metal. It's grounded that way. On a plastic gas tank in a more modern car, you'd have to have two wires coming off of here, not just one. So if we get close up so you can see this. So we have this kind of screen type thing here. It's on this car it's kind of small. It was a low performance application. Got a little plastic float. That float is on this little arm, goes up and down. So when you fill the tank up, fuel level rises, brings the float up. As you use fuel, the float goes down, and all the time, the resistance inside here is changing. And that resistance is between the metal ground and this metal strap right here. So this little terminal right here is where the wire would lead off to the wiring harness for the gauge. So pretty simple. In the olden days with a carburetor, this is pretty much all you had. So, as I said, this thing here kind of just became known as a sending unit, but in later years, it sort of took on some other roles, so I'm going to show you one of those in a minute. Before we move up to that, this is a sending unit out of a slightly more modern low-pressure fuel system. This is the sending unit for my 94 diesel truck. As we saw in a previous video, that truck uses a mechanical fuel pump on the engine to transfer the fuel from the tank up to the injection pump. So, this is my sending unit. It's got a metal ring up here. This drops in from the top of the tank. This is the strainer or the screen where the fuel gets taken in and kind of filters out the big chunks. Here's the variable resistor. What's cool about this one is it's open, it's exposed, unlike the old Fairlane one. So you can actually see the little printed circuit resistor on there. And you can see how as the float moves up and down, it sort of moves a contact across there. See if I can zoom in a little bit. There we go. You can see the contact inside there moving. Alright, what this one also has is a second line that comes back into the tank, and there's sort of like a little duckbill, like check valve there, and that's a return line. So the excess fuel that the engine doesn't need gets returned to the tank. So on the old carbureted application, that was a returnless system, so it was just one fitting because it was just one way out. In this case, it's got fuel coming out of the tank through one tube and fuel going back into the tank through the other tube. So, two old school low-tech sending units. As we went along and we switched to electric fuel pumps in later years, sometimes for carbureted applications, but more commonly for fuel-injected applications, this thing still was kind of called a sending unit, but it also became a pump hanger, because this is my fuel pump and it's hanging off of this sending unit, kind of living down in the gas tank. So the terminology starts to get kind of confusing. Sometimes they refer to it as a pump hanger. Sometimes they refer to it as a sending unit because it does include the sending unit. And the whole thing could be considered a fuel pump assembly. It just depends on how the manufacturer wants to sell it. So you may be able to purchase this sending unit separately and just change this sender if the gauge isn't working properly, and leave the pump alone and leave the hanger alone, if you will. You can buy the whole assembly, or you can also usually buy just the pump if the pump has failed and the sending unit's gone, and the hanger is, or the sending unit's okay and the hanger is okay. So they're serviced in different ways. On a more modern application, this one here is off of a mid-90s Ford truck. This went to the rear tank. So again, the sending unit I showed you yesterday in the first fuel system video, it would have looked exactly like this. The only difference is it didn't have a fuel pump in it. So this is for like a mid-90s Ford rear tank with fuel injection. So this is my fuel pump. And we're going to cover electric fuel pump separately in another video, but I'll just give you a little closer up view of that. That's what the electric fuel pump looks like. It's just sort of like a little cylinder here with a couple of wires going to it. Okay. Once again, we've got a strainer down in here. This little thing right here kind of looks like a little sock or a strainer. So that prevents larger particles and debris that might be in your gas tank from getting into the pump and wrecking the pump. And further down line, there should be another fuel filter somewhere. Once again, a little plastic float. So pretty simple. An outlet and a return line, just like the other one. So again, the examples I'm giving you here are kind of older. So 67 Ford, 94 Ford, another mid-90s Ford. Once you start getting past the 90s, the mid-90s in particular, these metal pump hangers started to kind of go away, and we saw the manufacturers change to a plastic pump hanger assembly, and sometimes they're not serviceable in any way other than the whole piece. It's sort of like a big plastic bullet that goes down into the gas tank, and the pump is inside, the sending unit's built into it. None of the pieces are sold separately, so it's just one big unit. In that case, they tend to refer to it as a fuel pump module. So again, you got to kind of know your terminology and be careful what you ask the parts supplier for when you're ordering parts. So sending units in the tank. It's going to contain a variable resistor. And a float. It's going to have a pickup screen. Some sort of strainer. And if it's modern and fuel injected, it's going to have a fuel pump attached to it as well. So again, for a modern application, it's going to be sort of like a big round plastic assembly that goes down into the tank. There'll be lines coming out of it. There'll be a wiring harness coming out of it. A plug. There's usually some springs that help push the rest of the assembly down into the bottom of the gas tank. And then it's just sort of like a big plastic round assembly that fits down in there. The pump is inside there. The sending unit would be attached to the side of it. So a little arm with the float. And then maybe hanging off the bottom of it, there'll be a strainer or a screen. Maybe not. I've seen them where they're internal. So basically that's all you see is a big plastic assembly. Unfortunately here in my own garage I don't have that style on hand to give you as an example. And on a more modern car, like for instance my 2006 Subaru, you're also going to have the fuel filter in the tank. So I showed you a couple of fuel filters yesterday. One of them was a big canister style fuel filter, the spin-on filter that was on my diesel, and one of them was an inline fuel filter, something kind of like this. This was on my Fairlane. So this is pretty typical for a fuel filter, an inline filter. Just has some fittings for hoses to attach, and this was the standard for many, many years. Somewhere around the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of manufacturers started to switch to in-tank fuel filters, basically lifetime fuel filters. So where we used to change these every 30,000 miles or so as part of regular maintenance, now you don't touch the fuel filter. It's in the tank, you leave it alone. So I have no idea what this fits. It's a Napa 3290. Could be a fuel injected application, could be a carbureted application, which I should mention, they are different. So if we're good on sending units, we'll put down a couple of notes about fuel filters before I go too far. So some are inline, so outside the tank. Those are easily serviceable, and then some are in the tank. And basically, that's a lifetime filter. You leave that alone. On some vehicles, it's actually pretty easy to get to it. You can get to mine in about 10 minutes in my Subaru, but again, it's considered a lifetime filter. You don't need to go in there and service it. So, one last thing. Carbureted or fuel injection. The difference is going to be the pressure that it's designed to work with. As we learned yesterday, a low pressure fuel system is only meant to be handling about 4 to 7 psi, where fuel injection is typically much higher. Old throttle body fuel injection systems were only about 13 psi, but multi-port injection systems that typically upwards of 30 can be up to about 60. So these are usually about 30